Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. So I didn't think I'd start making another quilt this soon, especially another Taylor Swift quilt, but here we are. Yes, I was planning to work on unfinished projects this year, but as soon as I was drafting this pattern just for fun, I knew I'd have big FOMO when it came to the Eras tour hype. So I quickly and impulsively committed to this project. So as an international Swiftie, I don't know if I'll get to this tour, no dates have been announced, and as the US pre-sales have been such a mess, I'm definitely nervous for the European leg. As someone who has seen a lot of these eras happen in real time, I'm very curious about this tour and I adore the poster, which is why I really wanted to recreate it. Despite its association with the Ticketmaster debacle and quite the lazy merch. I've only tried foundation paper piecing once and I really like this kind of modern aspect of quilting, so I wanted to attempt drafting my own pattern for this. Well, there are 10 sections representing the 10 albums. The way everything is laid out made it easy to split it into 12 blocks. I don't really have the expertise to explain what I exactly did as a quilter who's just started, but the main approach is to section an image based on straight lines and then use shorter straight lines to create details and curves. I watched some video tutorials but mainly improvised based on what I know about FPP. My first few attempts failed as I also tried to draft her facial features, which is way too advanced for my current skill level, so I decided to make her eyes, nose and mouths into appliques, which is how I made my previous quilt. I limited myself to 3 or 4 colors per block and figured I'd love to make her clothes with different fabrics as well. I mainly worked on 2 layers, the line art layer that creates the pattern, in which I'd sew every line that I've drawn, and the second, which is the colors I'd use. The second layer without the line art would show how the quilt would look like once I stitched all the blocks. And as I established the colors, I went back in and numbered all the blocks to create this paint by number drawing. It's very satisfying, so I was excited to print the pattern and get to work. Halfway through printing the pattern, I realized I made a big mistake, which is emphasized especially in the applique and FPP world. Your image has to be drawn or printed backwards. Since I was using a lot of tape to piece this thing together, me having to trace it again may be for the better. I also realized the quilt might be a little too big, still not sure how I feel about this size, but each block is about 35 centimeters or 13 inches, which is nice on its own, but it gets huge when you put 12 together. And then you haven't put the frame on it yet. It does have a lot of smaller details on some places that I, as a beginning FPPer, didn't want to fuss with, so I stuck with this size. Also because I didn't want to print this again and I like the idea of this being as big as my previous quilt. At this point, I couldn't really go back, so I decided to drown myself in this project for the next month, with the week of the tour starting as my deadline. While I had a few fabrics left over from the last quilt, it was definitely not enough, so I proceeded to spend 4 hours in the fabric store to explore every color combination for this quilt. I sorted them out and pretty much immediately started on the first block to see where my FPP skills were at that point. For each block, I traced them on pattern paper to get the backwards image, and I went back into Procreate to figure out the sections and the sewing order. Speak Now was the easiest due to the image being mainly her face. The contrast is pretty strong, and wardrobe-wise, the dress only has the shoulder straps showing, which I'll decorate by embroidering or something else simple one day. Even though I had the confidence to do this, I literally had to watch a video again to figure out how to start a FPP pattern again. I had to pick out my seams occasionally, but I think I did pretty alright. This took me 7 to 8 hours, which helped me to schedule the rest of the quilt throughout February. Next up was repetition, also one I considered relatively easy due to the face taking up a lot of space and was also the start to use non-cotton fabrics. I don't want to keep repeating myself throughout the piecing process, so let's establish the pattern here. I traced the pattern with only seam allowances on the borders for a faster process. I cut up the pattern into pieces. I established the first piece of fabric, fold the line for the second fabric, cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance, place the second piece of fabric underneath, fold paper open and sew the line, cut the seam allowance again, fold the fabric and press it. Continue till the piece is done and can be trimmed. This isn't an FPP tutorial, as almost all FPP content on YouTube are tutorials, but I'll show this process a few more times throughout this video. In this block, there's also a touch of the Midnights block. When a one-sided fabric is the first piece of a section, the right side faces down. And when it's not the first piece, the right side faces up. Piecing the sections together is quite easy, but I do make sure that the right points hit. It's a little harder since I don't have seam allowances on these smaller pieces, but it does make sense, and most of the times just lining up the raw edges was enough. If there are important meeting points, I'll make sure to pin those, but I'll improvise if no lines meet each other. Next up is folklore. I was actually struggling with folklore and evermore while drafting the pattern, but since the special fabric is quite simple, it's relatively easy block to piece. For her jacket, I used a knitting fabric that I stabilized by basting it on cotton. It was the first piece of the section, so again, right side facing down. Making curves in FPP is quite easy with these longer pointy pieces that I see a lot in FPP patterns. Again, this block has some midnight sections. You already saw the lace in the repetition block. But for the pants, I used a corduroy that does have stretch, but it's sturdy enough to work by itself. Most important was to make sure the ribs are vertical, but I'll get back to this in the midnights block. The folklore block might be my favorite of all these blocks. It's almost all cotton in all the right shades. I'm actually proud of the pattern, and even without the facial features, you can see the folklore image. I might actually sit down to properly draw out this pattern for sharing if people are interested. Dreading 1989 just a little bit, as I wanted to add sequins into this block. As the sequined fabric is quite lacy, I stabilized it onto cotton, also to have a background color. As I said before, when the one-sided fabric is the first piece, it points down, if it's not, it goes up. While it was intimidating to do this, it becomes a logical process after some mental gymnastics, muscle memory practice, and I was able to piece this just like the other fabrics, maybe with a little more basting and pinning. My machine and rotary cutter went through the sequence pretty easily, but obviously I changed the needles and the blade after this block. With the previous blocks, I traced them one by one as I was still practicing my drafting skills. And as I got better in recognizing FPP's do's and don'ts, I discovered some drafting mistakes that I could fix while tracing the pattern. After 4 blocks, I felt more comfortable batching the tracing part. So here you see me do multiple patterns, and I did a lot of them off camera as well. As I built all the skills I needed for this quilt, red went by pretty fast, but also because I knew deep inside I wasn't using the right colors. The contrast of the background and shading does give this block kind of like the Bowie look, but I did wish I took the effort to find a closer shade of red. So it's been a little over a week since I started sewing up the blocks, and I'm almost halfway through the blocks. So this is Speak Now. Fairly easy. My only mistake was this little piece that was supposed to be this lila shade of purple. It looks pretty good. Then I worked on the repetition, which also looks pretty good. And I also started on the midnights piece. You don't really see that this is velvet. I would have wanted something fluffier, but that would have been a pain to sew in, so velvet is fine. Then I worked on folklore. I really like this piece, but I just love this piece of the coat and just her hair being loose. It's very obvious. Then we had 1989, which is definitely the most sparkly one. Sometimes I'm doubting if going for sequins was a little too much, because this will definitely stand out compared to the other panels. But it's also the perfect choice. And yesterday I worked on red. I consider this I don't know how to feel about this. I might redo this one because it kind of looks like that repainted Jesus meme. This color is way too light, so I'm first gonna work on the rest and just see what I'm gonna do about this one. Maybe I'll just dye I've discovered that I should not be watching movies while working on this project because it's very distracting. I'm also getting very slow because it's getting repetitive. I still have 7 blocks to go, so that's a lot of work. But honestly, it is quite easy. My pattern isn't that complicated. I can get 1 panel a day done. And currently it's 11 a.m. Quite early, relatively. So today I'm just gonna try to get Fearless and Evermore done. So this is kind of a difference between having to have a whole separate part that I have to piece later, or one that I can just include in this piece to make it easier. So I compare the FPP technique as you have to create an open book. You have to create the spine, then you open the book. So first I had this upper line that didn't reach quite all the way to the point, which means that this triangle doesn't have a spine to anchor to. Yes, it does have this line, but there would be this little piece that would make piecing this piece more difficult. So the adjustment that I'm making is to draw the line to the point, so this line forms an entire spine. And then I have this book, and then I can anchor this piece to that piece, and then also finish off with this piece. As you can see, this triangle connects to the point, so that creates one long spine, instead of if I would have drawn this line to about here, because then I would have pieced this piece separately. Evermore gave me more smaller details to piece. I tried to give a lot of details to her bangs and braids. But it works the same: fold, fit, cut, sew, cut, roll. From now on, piecing all the blocks was getting quite repetitive, but at least now I'm halfway there. Next up was Fearless, of which the special effect was gonna be this gathered blouse. For the pieces that have this effect, I would gather a big rectangle of the linen fabric and then baste it onto a piece of cotton, similar to the laced fabrics. All the non-solids work the same. The seams with these double layered fabrics just get a little bulkier. Debut is at this point also a really easy block to work with, but before this I didn't have the fabric yet for her dress. I went for this green printed cotton, which was the last piece of the bolt, though originally I was considering a flow dress like it did with Fearless. I also wanted different fabrics for her guitar and guitar strap, but buying a big piece of fabric for just 2 sections would be a little overkill. I don't really agree with Debut being a green color album, but for the sake of this recreation I just went with Taylor's color choices. For Lover, I drafted her a heart-shaped earring, which meant a lot of tiny pieces and a lot of curves. At this point it was fun to have different skills to work on for different blocks, so this was a fun part. Despite the velvet, it was doable to piece the curves. I think if I approached this part differently, I would have been able to make this entire quilt a bit smaller, as this was the most detailed part. The other half of this block is Midnight's Taylor's hair, so I switched thread colors to finish off this half of the block, also finishing Taylor's 9 first albums. The bottom Midnight's block was relatively easy, with a lot of big pieces, and it got a little bit of the lace and corduroy. To make sure the ribs of the corduroy would be sewn in vertically, I made sure the ribs are parallel to the folded piece. So basically, the section under the folded part is how the piece will look like when it's sewn. There's a lot of parts with the zigzag lace, and design-wise I wish I altered a little more between the lace and just a solid, like her original top has, to show a little more variety and be a little more accurate to the photo. So today is the 21st of February. It's been pretty much 3 weeks since I started this project, and I'm currently working on one of the last blocks. It's also the most difficult one. I really should have designed it better. It's this one with her shoulder, and I'm not looking forward to do all these small pieces. I think I have all the non-clothing pieces done, but I'm about to start to work away on all the smaller ones. So currently I have this whole pile of panels. I don't know which one was the last one I showed you, but I do really like the Fearless one. It has the gathering of the shirt, which is a detail I really enjoy. And this is the first Midnight's block. And I am afraid that using white as the skin might be a little too bright. I couldn't find like a white fabric with a little bit hint of gray. So I hope in the bigger picture it's gonna be alright. And I really enjoy the amount of details in this panel. The last block will be her face, which is cotton only, so I'm really looking forward to working on it. But before that I do have to go through the mountain of a lot of pieces where I'll be working with lace. So that's exciting. So the middle Midnight's block seemed tedious, but at this point I've done a lot of paper piecing, so this wasn't too bad. While assembling, I just really had to check the order of all the small pieces, but I was able to distinguish my own pattern at least. And finally, the face, which was, like I predicted, the most fun part. Tons of pieces that are part of big sections, and like I said, cotton only, so everything's neat and flat. I also love the fractioned hair, and I love these shades of blue together. After almost 3 weeks of intense sewing, I finally finished all of the blocks, and while I'm proud of what I've achieved, there was also this wave of anxiety creeping up because this quilt is kind of bigger than it should be, and working with it is going to be a little tough physically. I kind of botched the red block. I've never done sashing, and my motivation was wearing off. From this point, I took a little longer to work on the quilt, took some evenings off, but I spent money on a lot of fabric, and this project had a deadline, so I was at least determined enough to keep going. I continued by making the facial features and the text from double-sided fusible interfacing by tracing everything reversed on that paper. My previous Me mural quilt is entirely made of this technique, so you can watch that video if you're interested. If you look well enough, you can see I actually messed up in this regard, so later I had to trace some of the faces again. I also traced the facial features onto the fabric to make sure I placed all the things in the right place. I'm definitely a bit unsure about all these nose holes. As for some blocks, I kind of make her look like Voldemort. With some blocks, I took the nose into account, like how Fearless is a sideways view, and Folklore has some shading representing the nose, but I crossed my finger that this would all look good in the end. This looks really good. I started attaching the blocks in groups of 3. Midnights obviously had to be properly attached to each other, and then I worked on the surrounding blocks. I made sure the blocks were meeting each other in the right spots. As all the borders do have paper seam allowances, I could also make sure it got pinned correctly. I found out I messed up a Midnight's piece, but as it was in the corner, it was easily fixed. After attaching the left and the right to the middle Midnight section, I sewed the top on and finished the main eras block. From now on, the rest of the process was going pretty fast. For the white section, I ripped some white fabric that would fit as the borders. It was relatively easy, but I also definitely sewed it on crooked in some places. For the text, I traced the locations of the letters, but only some corners, as I knew I wouldn't be cutting the letters perfectly as I traced them. This is again done with raw edge applique, as I really want the neat look of the font. There was a moment when I was drafting whether to include the bottom text, but as fonts were just as much a part of all the eras, this quilt wouldn't be complete without the text. As I finally finished the quilt top, I could rip out the pieces of paper. At some point I didn't even try to collect them, I just ripped out as much as I could and decided to clean up afterwards. This does show the reality that this is quite a wasteful project, not even thinking about all the fabric scraps that I'm creating. Sandwiching is physically always a challenge. Fortunately, my place is just big enough to have everything lay flat. I just tape everything to the floor. Basting was done using safety pins, and I did 5 pins per block and did the rest for the surrounding border. For quilting, I started off making a grid stitched in the ditches of the blocks. This would also help basting the blocks and the sashing as well. I got a stitch in the ditch foot for this, thinking I would also use it to quilt the blocks, but I ended up only using it for this part. Not entirely sure if it was a useful purchase. Even with the foot, it's easy to slip with the needle. Then I stitched all the facial features and the leathers. In my previous quilt, all the tiny ironed-on appliques were falling off while handling the quilt, so this time I wanted to get all the loose pieces sewn down as soon as possible. Obviously wearing my grippy gloves again to move the quilt easier. So I wasn't gonna quilt this heavily, mainly because of time, but I was also terrified of ruining the quilt at this point. I stitched in the ditch or next to the ditch when I could match thread colors with sections on the block, pretty much avoiding too much loose bedding between the top and the backing. I plan to use this as a wall hanging anyway, so it's quilted enough, but once I have a bit more confidence and the right thread colors, I kind of want to quilt every seam. I think Evermore is the only block that looks a lot rougher after being quilted, so I know that saying me ruining it is quite the exaggeration. So today is March 3rd, and I hope this is the last day I'll be working on this quilt. It is currently 12:41, so I have the entire day. All I have to do left is to quilt Reputation, Fearless, and Midnights. I'm not heavily quilting this. Stitch in the ditch takes a lot of time. I'm gonna zigzag stitch the borders. Over there you can already see a little bit. I was getting too excited. It's important to first quilt the blocks because the zigzag stitches are gonna cover all the seams. So I only did that part because it does take a lot of threads. So my bobbin ran out. I'm gonna cut binding. I'm probably just gonna do it on the grain because it's just all a straight edges. So I don't think cutting on the bias is needed for now. And then just do a little bit of cleaning up. For example, at the text I still have to cut these little threads. But it's looking good. We're almost there. I do know a lot of people prefer stitching next to the ditch, and I think it's time to agree. Since I don't have all the matching thread colors, I can't do it for all the pieces now, but definitely something I would like to revisit in the future. After quilting the last few blocks, I zigzagged all the borders to really section off the areas. I have some zigzag projects coming up, so this was a nice moment to test my machine for this. So now my quilt is pretty much finished and only needed to be trimmed and bound. I measured 13 centimeters from the sides, 9.5 centimeters from the bottom, and 7 centimeters on the top to make it to scale as the original poster. As you can see, I didn't really block the size of the Eras part, so you can see some warping at 1989 and Lover, so I tried to straighten it in the sashing. And on top of that, I added 1.5 centimeters for the binding. Like I said, I made binding tape on the grain and folded and pressed it as I sewed it on. I knew last time I was just on the edge when it came to the thread showing in the front. This time I was really doing a terrible job binding, so I unpicked and plugged the first line of stitching to clean up the quilt. And after 33 days since its conception, I finished my Eras Tour quilt. Overall, I am very happy with the quilt and I really can't wait to hang it up next to the me mural quilt one day. I do admit that I do have a hard time truly loving the quilt as it doesn't feel finished or quilted enough with the minimal quilting I did. I don't have tickets for the actual tour yet. I doubt whether using different fabrics was too gimmicky and wasteful, and I gave up a lot of time I was supposed to be running, putting some upcoming races in jeopardy. On the other hand, it makes me happy to have this before the tour starts. This really scratched the FPP and Eras Tour itch, and I do think it's a beautiful result. Maybe a bit wacky, but for someone who's never drafted an FPP pattern, I think I did a pretty good job. I think maybe once I see more of the tour, maybe get to go myself, I will feel inspired to potentially quilt some Eras symbols, lyrics, or commit to Stitch in the Ditch. Or again, next to the ditch. We don't have a strong quilt culture here, so I'm not very comfortable with using these as blankets, but yesterday the tour blanket was the nearest thing on the couch and it was actually quite comfortable to use. This quilt and the me mural quilt really show how I'm willing to drop everything to make a quilt, and I'm actually a little sad to be focusing on garment sewing for the upcoming months. But I'll probably make a quilt soon for my boyfriend that he can actually use, and while I was supposed to work on this video, I may have drafted another entire FPP quilt. This cycle never ends. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. Hopefully this was in any form or shape useful for you to watch, and I'll see you next time. Bye!